Hey guys, I'm going to be answering a question from YouTube user ArrowHalo, who asked, I love your videos, but I'm not sure what's what. Or is it right to feel or do this, that, or the other? I can take the awareness thing and try, but this confuses me as to what I should do or not. Or is it the mind or the higher self or my ego? You see where I'm going with this? Thank you, Arrow, for your question. I believe I see where you're going, hopefully. I think if I were to condense your question, you probably are wanting to know, how do I tell the difference between a thought that's coming from my ego or from my higher self? And this is a great question, a question I get asked a lot, actually. And in order for me to answer this question adequately, we need to have a consensus definition of what ego is. Now, there's many definitions of ego from person to person. And one of the definitions I hear a lot from people is this idea that the ego is anything that makes you a human being whatsoever. So all of your personality is your ego. All of your biological impulses are ego. So on and so forth. Terence McKenna has a great quote about this where he says, we need some degree of ego, or else we wouldn't know whose mouth to put the spoon in when we're going out to dinner, right? And so if this is your definition of ego, then yes, of course, you would need some ego. But I find this to be a very useless and unhelpful definition. If we make this our definition of the ego, then nobody ever has a clue what we're talking about. And so I find it very helpful, or at least the way that I like to teach ego is that the ego is only the part of our psychology which creates mental suffering. Because all the other parts of our psychology are good personality traits, our biological impulses and cravings and all these things that are inherently neutral and don't cause suffering. We don't need to get rid of those, right? When we're talking about what we're trying to dissolve or transcend, we only want to transcend that which makes us suffer. And if I define suffering, I would say suffering is simply the absence of peace of mind. So in self-realization or enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, finding freedom, we're really just talking about finding or achieving rather a state of unbroken peace of mind. So the ego is the part which takes away our peace of mind. So a very simple answer to your question could be, any thought which takes away my peace of mind to any extent, we can be sure is based in the thought system of the ego, not the true self. But let's go a little further into this. When I define the ego as the part of the mind that creates suffering, a lot of times the next natural question will be, well, then why do we have an ego? Right? Did the universe make a mistake or something? And in order to understand why the ego is not a mistake, it's helpful to understand where it came from. I have a whole video about this already, which I'll link up here. It's called What is the Ego? So I'm not going to go into huge detail on this, but the basic idea is that the ego is the part of our mind which was developed through 1,000,000+ years of Darwinian evolution. It was developed around the time where we transitioned from the second density of consciousness, which is insect or animal or plant, any sentient being which does not have self-awareness yet, but there's movement and awareness there. We transitioned to the third density, which is self-awareness, and as far as we know, humans are the only self-aware beings on the planet. During that transition from second to third density, we needed something to be developed to help us make that transition, to help us evolve. And that's what we call the ego. Now, the ego is, again, a product of Darwinian evolution or natural selection, which means it is 100% survival based. It's only looking out for our survival. It's only programmed for that one thing. And this is why it causes us to suffer, because from nature's perspective, from Darwinian evolution's perspective, it does not pay off to be positive, ever, right? If you are positive, and you're wrong, you might get eaten by a lion. But if you're negative all the time, if you're always skeptical, paranoid, fearful, on guard, then you stand a much better chance of survival. So simply through the process of natural selection, these programs of fear, anxiety, worry, stress, anger, all of these are spin-offs of the biological fight or flight impulse. These would have been very useful to survival, which is why they were created, right? So the ego essentially doesn't really know we're not in jeopardy at any given moment. It's just responding to stimulus. It's just responding to conditioning. It's an automatic, mechanical, and impersonal reaction. So the thought system of ego, because of this survival orientation, it's always investing each thought with some level of guilt. Guilt is sort of the linchpin of the ego. So it's either fight or flight, which means fight, you're guilty, or flight, I'm guilty. The ego requires an identity to speak to. The ego is identity, essentially. So whenever there's egoic thinking, it's never actually the thoughts which are the problem. The thoughts are simply an effect. What the problem is our belief in the ego's thought system, right? If there is no belief, no identification with the thought system of ego, then all those types of thoughts can't appear in the mind, because who would they appear to? They need an identity to speak to. So the problem is always the cause, not the effect. One of my favorite sayings from Jesus that I quote a lot is when he said, "You always know a tree by its fruit," right? A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. So whenever there is a thought that's troubling us, we need to put it under self-inquiry, right? Put it on trial and investigate. Does this thought create suffering or take away my peace of mind? Yes, ego. Is this thought invested with guilt? If yes, ego. And the third big one, big giveaway, would be the belief in separation. The belief in separation is the ego's religion. And separation is ultimately what creates fear. Fear is what creates guilt. Guilt is identification. So the thought system of ego is based in separation, and the true self is the perfect polarity of ego in every way. They're sort of like yin and yang. So they are diametrically opposed in every aspect. So ego based on separation, true self based upon oneness. Ego based upon time, right, past and future. True self based upon eternity or present moment. Ego is always coming and going, appearing, disappearing. It's impermanent. The true self is constant. It is permanent, not impermanent. It doesn't come and go. So when we understand these distinctions, then catching ego becomes a lot easier, right? Because I can just go to the root of the emotion being caused and say, does this cause suffering? Then yes, that must be coming from ego. Does this make me feel guilty or assign guilt to someone else? The true self will never invest guilt. The true self will never speak of fear or anxiety or separation. It only knows oneness. It only knows its true nature, which is perfect and complete. It knows nothing of time. It doesn't speak to you based on past or future, but always now. So what really happens for the ego to get our attention is that the biological fight or flight impulse, which is inherently neutral, again, and impersonal, is triggered by a stimulus of our conditioning. Ego takes that emotion and puts it in front of us and says, see, look at this, you are guilty, or they are guilty. And it uses that emotion as leverage. And then we either identify and believe, or we don't. The extent to which we believe is the extent to which we fuel that thought pattern with more energy. So the next time it appears, it has a little bit more force behind it. So just because you recognize the illusion of ego in any moment doesn't mean the effect, you will not feel the effect, because you will. The effect is a result of the fact that in the past you'd energized that thought. But what it does mean is that you detach from the thought and you no longer give it fuel. So it's essentially as if you've stopped throwing wood on the fire and the fire has to burn out. So there will be still psychological suffering in that moment, but you can understand that this suffering is not my doing. And this is really where peace of mind comes back in. The ego must get you to feel guilty because it needs you to take credit for its actions. It needs you to make yourself or another person guilty, which is ultimately the belief that I am the doer, they are the doer. But when we investigate the nature of negative reactions, of egoic reactions, we can find very quickly that they are not a personal doing. They're always impersonal. They're an automatic, triggered reaction to stimulus, completely impersonal. I'll give you a quick example of this. I was walking my dog a few weeks ago, and another person was coming by me with a dog, a much bigger dog. I have a little Shih Tzu. And I thought to myself, hope this dog's friendly. And I could see it looking at Bodhi, and I'm like, let's just be cool here. And I'm thinking this person wouldn't be walking right past me if they knew their dog is prone to attack or whatever. And the dog, sure enough, as soon as it gets close to Bodhi, starts, doing its thing, and Bodhi's freaking out, and the dogs are tangling their leashes together. And I found myself screaming, "Hey, stop that!" at the other dog to get its attention. There was a lot of anger behind it. I was angry that the dog was attacking my dog for no reason. It got the dog's attention enough for me to just yank my dog away. And the person, "Oh, I'm so sorry," And I felt my anger from that impulse directing towards the person for a moment. Like, "Yeah, asshole, take control of your dog next time." I felt that was what the ego wanted to say. But I caught it in that moment that, no, this anger wasn't personal. I wasn't angry at the person or even the dog. It was a fight or flight impulse that was triggered to protect my dog, and it was very appropriate. It actually accomplished its goal. It saved my dog. After the fact, the ego tried to quickly create a story out of it and say that person should have known better, right? And so if I had chosen to say, "Yeah, you're right, that person should have known better," then I invest them with guilt and I create suffering. I'm now in a state of suffering. But because I didn't do that, I simply walked along my way, and just like my own dog who was attacked, both of us just sort of dropped it. There was no story created out of it. And so that was a moment where I had a sort of epiphany that anger itself isn't suffering. It's the expectation we have that we shouldn't be suffering, or we shouldn't be angry rather, or it is the story we create out of that, rather the story the mind creates out of the biological reaction, fight or flight. So in order to reprogram yourself to stop taking personal ownership over the conditioned reactions of ego, a little mantra that I developed that's been really useful for me is, let's say, anger arises. As soon as I catch it, it doesn't matter if it was, the first second it appeared or 3 minutes into feeling angry. All that matters is that I do become aware of it. Oh, I'm in a program right now. As soon as I recognize that, I say to myself, okay, anger is arising, not my doing. And you can use that with anything. Okay, fear is happening, not my doing. Depression is happening. Judgment is happening, not my doing. If you look for the moment where you consciously chose to become angry, you will never find it. It is never a conscious, personal doing. It is always an impersonal, programmed reaction. And the extent to which we aren't aware of this, we continue to feed it energy, and so this reaction can turn into, all the way down the spectrum, it can become murder or rape or something terrible, right? But it all started at the beginning of the chain of taking personal credit for the ego's thoughts. The true self is never entangled in the ego's doing. The true self is always in a much deeper place of consciousness, observing everything, right? Just the fact that you can know that you're suffering or know that you're in anger means there's a part of you that isn't. And that is the true self. That part of you only knows oneness. It only knows love. It only knows forgiveness, innocence, peace. And so ultimately, only loving thoughts are true. And anything else is a cry for help. This is a foundational teaching in A Course in Miracles. If someone's behaving insanely, in rage and anger and insecurity, whatever, that's really the true self within them crying out for help, saying, I'm in a state of suffering. I can't see clearly. I can't find a better point of view than this one, and it's hurting me. So we, in any given moment, when we're around somebody or with somebody who is in a programmed reaction and they don't realize it, the best thing we can do is not to tell them, hey, you're an ego right now, knock it off. That's only going to fuel their ego. The best thing we can do is to be the presence that they need, to be the conscious awareness which doesn't get involved. It's not taking their action seriously. It's seeing through the illusion of anger that that's not actually you, that's the program, and I will only see your true self. And when I only see your true self, I allow you to see it because I am your mirror. So if I give in to their reaction and get riled up with them, then I'm fueling it and causing them to go further into it. So we have the power to either take people further into ego or further out of ego. And really that's our only, you could say, responsibility in any moment, is to be the conscious awareness, be the presence that they need. Nothing more is actually needed beyond that. And you can't talk somebody out of a program because it's not a conscious doing on their part. They're deeply identified with something that's illusory in nature. So it's up to them to see that. And it's actually our suffering which allows us to see that. So never worry about the effect, the thought. Always worry about the cause. If I'm experiencing egoic thoughts, if I'm judging others, judging myself, feeling angry, feeling resentful, whatever, that's a symptom of the fact that I am believing in the ego's thought system of separation. I am believing that I am this body. So that's really the thing to work on, is to see through that illusion of I am the body and recognize that your nature is oneness, that everything is interconnected, everything depends on everything else. I am one great happening in the infinite mind of the one being. I am the one being. The more that we know that, even if it's as a concept, that concept goes to work on the ego's programs and starts to dissolve them, because there's less and less belief invested in separation, and the truth of oneness, which is the overlying truth of the universe, is given more and more belief and conviction. And the mind can only speak to whatever identity is present. So it's a process, it's not a instantaneous happening. So we have to have patience with ourselves. We have to allow ourselves to feel everything we're feeling, because that's simply a remnant of the past, where past attention was going. And we can feel it out of the body by not attaching to it, letting it have its natural expression. And the more and more we do this, we're sort of cleansing our state of being from these negative energies, which again have to be expressed somewhere. And we can begin to cultivate a sense of deeper awareness of there is a dimension inside of me that is not involved in these programs and doesn't want to be. It's already complete in its true nature. And so our true nature is peace of mind. Peace of mind is not a phenomenon like anxiety or fear. Anxiety is an event. Peace is not an event. It is simply what is there when suffering is not there. It is always present. So in any moment of egoic thinking where you detect suffering or guilt or separation or fear, all these tall tale signs, you can become aware of that and recognize, okay, but I could see peace instead, because peace is present always, because I am peace. So again, anger arises, not my doing. Fear is arising, not my doing. And this mantra gives such a sense of relief and spaciousness inside of yourself. And you begin to release your personal identification with the programs of ego. Slowly over time, these programs appear with less and less force until there is just your natural state, which is stillness, which is not in a state of reactivity. The true self responds to the moment, but it doesn't react to the moment. It's not triggered by a stimulus. The true self still screams at the dog, but it doesn't have any guilt assigned to that anger. So you can sort of see the differences here. We're talking about subtleties of the spiritual path. This is all conceptual until you experience it. But each and every one of us has experienced this to be true throughout our entire life. And if you reflect back on any moment in your life that you can remember where there was a lot of suffering, you can find, there's where the guilt was being assigned. There's where the belief in separation was. And just these recognitions of awareness is what begins to set us free from egoic thinking. So the bottom line, if you don't want the effects of a thought system, then don't believe in the thought system. Make that your main goal, your main mission, is to see the unreality of the ego's way of thinking. Because if you remove the cause, the effects will vanish.